Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. On the third Thursday of each month in the last few months, I have been relaying some of the information I've learned on my long-term road trip that I've been taking in Sophie, my converted Sprinter camper van. And we have had a blast. Last time we spoke, I was in Colorado. Today, I've gone back to South Dakota. I am starting my northern and then heading eastern, heading back towards my home state of North Carolina. And so today we're going to start in South Dakota. We're going to go through the Dakotas, Minnesota, the upper Midwest, and I hope you enjoy it. So let's get started. Last August, in my ignorance of a different culture, I headed to South Dakota. The beautiful rolling hills of the Black Hills I drove through were loaded with motorcycles, and I just thought they liked riding on these kinds of roads. It wasn't until I made it to Mount Rushmore when I saw 10 bajillion motorcycles that I inquired of a biker waiting like me for a finicky parking payment machine to behave itself. The guy chuckled when I said, "Is there some kind of like a motorcycle convention going on or something like that?" And he explained to me that it was the 80th anniversary of Sturgis, the country's largest motorcycle rally. And ironically, as I record this, Sturgis is once again going on in South Dakota in the Black Hills. Needless to say, for somebody who likes to enjoy the outdoors in the peace and quiet, this section of South Dakota was not the best place for me to be, especially during COVID in the summer of 2020. So I drove through the town of Sturgis just because I wanted to see it, but I kept it inside my van, kept the windows up and all that kind of thing. And then I headed out of town knowing that I'd love to come back and explore this area once again. And again turns out to be now, the following year. Using my iOverlander app, I saw there was a nice U.S. Forest campground just north of the cute town of Custer. I hoped if I got there by noon, I'd be able to snag a spot for the night. Fortunately, there were 2 spaces left when I arrived. At federal campgrounds, you can book in advance on reservation.gov, but at this particular site, they also keep 4 sites open for walk-in people like me. And because I never know exactly how long I want to stay someplace until I see it and check out their internet service, I try not to book in advance. And during the crowds that I've seen during this COVID time in this second summer of COVID, that has sometimes been very difficult. So I've been it's been kind of a crapshoot of whether I'm going to find a suitable place or not. This week is supposed to be super hot, and even though I thought I would be through after 3 days, I didn't want to worry about trying to find a place for the weekend, so I just went ahead and booked through Saturday night so I didn't have to worry about it, and that would also put me at Theodore Roosevelt National Park on a Sunday, which I'm hoping means that I'll have pretty good luck getting a decent campsite there as well. I lucked out and got a nice shady spot. There weren't utilities, but there was a pit toilet nearby and a water pump, and I get 1 bar of cell service, only if I get by the entrance and hold the phone in a certain way, but I'd seen people doing that and I realized, I can do this, I can make this work. At least I can let my family know that I'm okay. I had stopped by the visitor center in Custer to get the scoop and to come up with a plan for my 4 days here. I decided which trails I want to hike, plus I want to bike some of this really nice rails to trails I'd seen alongside the road on my way to Custer. Turns out this path was a super long trail that runs many towns, and I could see that it was gravel, and I was a little bit worried. I still have a bit of mental scarring from that bike fall I had last April, and so I figured this is going to be a good test for me to see if the new nubbier tires I bought could grip some loose gravel. In the visitor center, I saw this huge picture of the Cathedral Spires. I'm like, I want to go see that while I'm here. So I added that to my list. I decided I'm going to hike that in the morning, and to beat the crowds, I'm going to head out the crack of dawn. Fortunately, I see that there's a warning sign on the road that takes me to the trailhead that I'm going to take in the morning. This sign indicates a teeny tiny tunnel up ahead that was only 9 feet 8 inches high and only 8 feet wide. Yikes! I couldn't remember exactly what Sophie's clearances were. You rarely see any bridges under 11 feet clearance, and it had been well over a year since I measured her. I didn't have a tape measure, and I sure didn't want to have my skylights or worse ripped off. I knew I had to be somewhat close to that measurement, so I had to come up with another way to measure. First, I stood up on my 5-gallon potty bucket and took a string measurement, adding about 2 feet above the height higher than what I could reach. And then I guesstimated foot-long instruments with this string, and that came in just at under 10 feet, but over 9 feet, so that was not enough margin of error for my comfort level. Then I took out a PVC pipe I had in Sophie that I used for the shower stall I had made, and using a piece of paper, I knew exactly what 11 inches was. I estimated another inch, and again, it was so close to that clearance, I was getting really nervous. I was like, I gotta find a hardware store. And so I get one, and turns out that Sophie is 9 feet 3 inches. That means I have a 5-inch margin of error. So even though that's a little twitchy, mathematically, she should fit in this skinny tunnel. I'm still a little bit concerned because if for some reason I guessed wrong, because 5 inches isn't a whole lot, I was hoping there'd be at least a place I could turn around on this mountain road. And so I want to get up there really, really early before anybody. So if I have to back up or do something funky, I didn't want to hold up traffic at all. While I was in town getting the tape measure, I decided to ride a little bit on the Rails to Trails. This Rails to Trail is fee-based. It's the first one I've ever seen that was. You can pay a nominal fee for a daily use, or if you're going to be using it for more than 4 or 5 days, the annual pass is going to be more economical. I stuffed my $4 in my bike shorts and headed off to find the pavement box. Before I found it, though, the pavement in town switched to that really thick crushed limestone, and I decided you really do need a mountain bike for this trail. My bike wasn't going to cut it. And I did not want to risk falling again, so I opted to bike around town for a couple hours just to get my legs, lungs, and bottom used to riding again. I'm still a little bit intimidated about my upcoming Croatia bike trip because that's going to be hard, and I've got to start getting on this bike and get out of my normal hiking routine. I've got to start adding a lot more bike into my routine. So at least in town, I was able to go up and down some hills. They busted my butt, but it was a nice ride, and there weren't a whole lot of cars on the streets, and the lilacs were in full bloom, so at least it was really nice smelling as well. So in the morning, now I'm going to tackle that tunnel. And just to be on the safe side, like I said, I got there super early just in case. And so about 6:30 in the morning, up ahead is the tunnel. Fortunately, there's a pull-off right next to it, so you can check out a rock feature called the Eye of the Needle, which is a vertical rock formation that literally has a cutout that does resemble a needle's eye. Happily, there was no one on the road, so I parked Sophie in front of the tunnel. Then I could step back and then get a good look at the clearance. There wasn't but a few inches, but I could see she'd be fine. A little further up was another tunnel that had an extra inch at the top, but it was long, like over 100 feet long, and it had jagged granite poking down from the top, and it looked skinnier than the one I just went through. Focusing on just staying in the center because there wasn't much clearance on either side of my mirrors, I did make it through. I bet you these tunnels are a mess when the crowds come because you're going to have traffic going both ways. I don't see how they do it. Driving along, I noticed the turnoff for the Devil's Tower trailhead. That's going to be my second hike of the day, en route to the Cathedral Spires. I figured the Cathedral Spires would be more popular, so I wanted to get there first to avoid any crowds. And it turns out it's good to get there early anyway because there aren't a lot of parking spots. Neither of my day's hikes were going to be long, but they were steep and they were rated strenuous, mostly due to some rock scrambles as you neared the top. The rock in Black Hills is beautiful in a rounded yet rugged way. The rocks aren't black, but more gray with occasional beige tones. Similar to Bryce Canyon, they are vertically shaped, but more rounded tip blobs instead of red blobby stacked delicate pinnacles. Think meaty, muscular hands versus dainty pianist fingers, with those fingers pointed straight up as if in prayer, one right after the other. The forest is filled with pines and aspen, which makes a nice contrast to the rocks. Near the lake, I hear the song of red-winged blackbirds. As I climb, I hear birdsong in the upper story, but I'm not familiar with their tune. And we were up pretty high. My hikes today were over 6,000 foot elevation, with gains on the trail between 500 and 700 feet. Tomorrow, I'll be hiking the highest mountain in the U.S. east of the Rockies, the Black Elk Peak at 7,244 foot elevation. But today, on both trails, because I was so early, I had the paths mostly to myself. The first rock scramble was easy enough. I've done much harder, and I liked how the rock had chipped out nooks and crannies I could get a hold of with my feet and my toes. The Cathedral Spires looks like an amphitheater of organ pipes. Just beautiful. Up top you can see for miles around. It was super windy and still a bit chilly, so I didn't linger very long. And while I may have poo-pooed them rating my first hike as strenuous, it was a true rock scramble on my second hike. You hike to the top normally enough, but as with the first hike, once you get near the summit, you've got to start climbing these rocks. On this trail, first you had to squeeze yourself through a crevasse not much wider than your body, all while climbing up. Sometimes you had to use your arms like Spider-Man to hold up your body while your feet tried to catch up. Once you make it through the crevice, the fun really begins. It's really quite the rock scramble. There were 2 couples around my age whom I met along the trail that turned around at this point. I didn't think it was scary, and I suppose you could get hurt if you fell and hit your head, but you weren't exposed to any cliff drop-offs, so I figured as long as I was super careful with my foot placement and made sure I was balanced before lifting the other foot, I'd be fine. Most of my past rock scrambles had boulder climbs where you work your way up and around boulders. This was closer to actual rock climbing, where your hands sought pointy rocks to grab a hold of and your feet were seeking little dents to get some leverage and to balance yourself. I actually thought it was kind of fun, and I thought the real worry for me at least was going to be getting back down, which I always find more difficult, especially when there's some kind of drop. The view up on top was worth it, despite the wind. There were a couple of young men resting near the top, but once I was at the summit, I had the view all to myself. Finding a sheltered and sunny rock to hang out on, I enjoyed a nice snack and a break. In the morning, I tackled the park's most popular trail, the Big Black Elk Trail, to an old stone fire tower at South Dakota's highest point and the highest peak east of the Rockies. I'm on the trail before 7 to beat the heat and the crowds, although we don't seem to be having the heat wave that's blistering the rest of the country. The high today is going to be in the low 80s, and I woke up and it was in the upper 40s, perfect sleeping weather. My plan is to make the hike a loop. I'll hike first to the peak and fire tower, and then swing around near the Cathedral Spires, and then connect up to a section of Devil's Tower that I did yesterday. This proved to be a good plan, as I had most of the trail to myself, but as I headed back down to the connector trail, I could see plenty of hikers incoming. Happily, I didn't see a lot of people again until I connected up with the Devil's Tower leg, and then I was able to coast into where I parked by only seeing a couple of other people, and later saw some climbers tackling the massive rocks surrounding the Sylvan Lake when I walked around it. My hike today had almost 1,500-foot elevation gain on the 3 some odd miles up, but it seemed pretty gradual in most places. At the top, you're rewarded with a breathtaking panoramic view of the Black Hills and all these jutting spires. The fire tower looks like a miniature medieval castle, and you have to literally hike and climb up one of the pinnacles to reach it. I'd seen this thing in the distance yesterday, and I'm glad I now know what this bizarre structure is. I thought it might be some old monastery or something like that when I first saw it, but it turns out it's only big enough for the watchman to have had a tiny apartment, but what a view. In addition, similar to the prayer flags I saw in Bhutan, folks up here wrap a bandana or other piece of colorful cloth around poles, and in one case they did so to a large fossilized tree. It brought back fond memories of my time in Bhutan that you can hear about in episodes 20 and 21. I'll put links in the show notes. So in Bhutan and many of the Buddhist countries, the prayer flags are meant to send blessings to all sentient beings as they blow in the wind. It's a lovely tradition. I actually even got some that I put on my screen porch at my old house. Loved it. I really like the Black Hills, and I'm glad that I made the trip back to explore them in greater detail. From here, and actually from the town of Custer, you drive right by Crazy Horse, which is a massive mountain carving of the famous Indian chief. His distinctive profile is finished along with the outline of his outstretched pointed arm leading the charge. There's a hole that will start the opening from his arm over the head of his horse. It looked pretty similar to what I saw last year, but I imagine it's just a massive undertaking to do this, what I think is going to take generations to carve out this mountain to honor the great former chief. Mount Rushmore isn't too far either. The interpretive movie explains how everything was carved and built. It's quite a story. In fact, the original idea was to carve them into the Black Hills, but they found that the stone was unsuitable. Badlands National Park is also close by, So if you want to plan a trip out here, you could really fly into Rapid City, South Dakota, rent a car, and then see it all pretty easily in one trip. I don't have a lot of places on my wish list to see in North Dakota, one of the last states I've yet to visit. But first up is Theodore Roosevelt National Park outside of Medora. Or I should say the south unit of the park is outside Medora. There's a north unit that I did not visit, but I was told by fellow hikers that I met that was more Badlands looking like you'd see in South Dakota. I arrived in Medora late afternoon and secured a campsite at the campground that was right in town. I could have dispersed camp, but I really liked the idea of walking into town and getting a nice hot meal. At around 7 p.m., I chose the restaurant named Boots and sat at the bar. I loved seeing all the cowboys, but people there were in their own groups. It appears I chose a locals joint, and I could tell people were curious about me, but nobody paid me much mind. Until, I should say, I got sandwiched between two men, and the one on my left was fairly intoxicated. They explained to me that they'd been kicked out of the dining room for not eating anything, just drinking. The younger man on my right didn't seem to be under the influence. I told myself this is the chance one takes, and considered moving seats as the place was starting to thin out, but it turns out that the young man was quite interesting, and I actually enjoyed our conversation. After I ordered the bison burger, and that was the first bison burger I ever had, it was pretty good. It's a lot leaner than beef, and I learned from the yak burger that I had with Jenny in Colorado that these other meats seem to pair really well with a strong cheese like the blue cheese. Being a bit of a germphobe, normally after touching the menu and always before I eat, I go wash my hands. But with these two strange men literally invading my private space and just deciding that they were hanging out with me that day, I decided I did not want to leave my drink unattended, so I decided I'd rather have the germs. I actually had a pretty nice evening. Like I said, the young guy was interesting. The other guy was just kind of drunk and after a while just kind of hung out there. But it turned out to be kind of fun. I learned a lot about the whole area from the young man. Being so far north, the sun stays out a long time. So it's still broad daylight when I finally got back to Sophie, even though it was after 9 o'clock. So being this far north, not only does it stay light late into the night, it also gets light early in the morning, and the birds get up. Oh my, the birds were singing at the top of their lungs around 4 o'clock in the morning. Great sound, but I could have used a little bit more sleep. At 5, I gave up trying to sleep anymore and headed to the park. This park is like Badlands, but with more greenery, and sometimes there's some pasture-like land. At one of the visitor centers, there's a painted canyon that you don't even have to hike in to see. They have a nice overlook, and you see all the multicolored striations of the rock and the soil layers. It's really cool. The entrance to the inside of the park has another large canyon that isn't quite as colorful, but was lit up with the early morning light and was beautiful. This hour of the morning, I was the only car on the road, except for a little bit later, I saw 3 horse trailers moving the horses to the stables for upcoming rides. There was one long trail I wanted to hike, but then there was a half a dozen tiny trails at the different viewpoints, so I drove the scenic road just to knock off the little trails first. They have multiple longer trails, including the long-distance Marais Trail, which runs through the park. Some of them are by the Little Missouri River, and others to the Badlands. Again, I'm struck at how the landscape can change so dramatically, so nearby each other. At some places, I'm looking into a canyon. Others, it's a rolling vista. And some places are stark badlands where you feel like you're post-apocalyptic or post-nuclear war. Just nothingness, but this stark stone. This is actually where the former President Theodore Roosevelt came to lick his wounds after losing both his wife and daughter on the same day. In fact, he is credited with starting the preservation of some of our unique national lands, and this is the only park that's actually named for a single person. I've certainly seen prettier landscapes, but I do get the appeal. It has this rugged beauty about it. The harsh winters here, it's not uncommon for negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And based on all the windbreaks I see planted around people's homes, that doesn't include the wind chill. I'll bet they just howl across these plains. People who live here must be made of tough stuff, but the locals love it. In fact, that young non-drunk had moved around the country, spending 8 years in Arizona, but he eventually moved back. When I asked why, he said it was for the people. He said they are the best people in the world, and without hesitation, everyone would do anything to help you. That's not a bad reputation to have. And there's plenty of wildlife to see in this park. I had to stop to allow bison to cross the road on several occasions, and many of the pastures were filled with them. Once I thought I was looking at some big trees on the butte until they moved and I realized it was a couple of bison. They have wild horses here too, and I saw 2 of them, including a little foal. Add that to 4 wild turkeys, an abundance of prairie dogs, and by abundance I mean they have hundreds if not thousands of prairie dogs. Where they have these large populations of prairie dogs, they call them Prairie Dog Towns, and there are more than a half a dozen of these massive towns within the park. If you're driving, you may not notice them at first because their prairie dog fur is the same color as the soil. And in fact, I'm still not sure if they were sleeping when I first arrived or else my eyes had not gotten trained to see them, because as I drove out after all my hikes, I saw the prairie dog guards outside their burrows standing upright, ready to sound the alarm everywhere. And when they get nervous, their little tail jerks and twitches, and it's kind of cute. In fact, on my longer hike, the Lower Paddock Creek Trail, the guard prairie dogs would bark out the alarm bell. It's more like a little chirpy bark. The only time this bothered me was when I was heading back from my hike. You see, on the way there, I turned a blind corner, and there was this ginormous sleeping bison blocking the trail. Fortunately, I didn't wake or startle him, because they can charge you at 40 miles an hour. I just quietly backed away and climbed up and over the hill to get away from him. So heading back, I'm on red alert, watching out for him. I only saw 2 other couples and asked them if he was still there, and they told me yes. I recognized the hill where I'd bypassed the big guy earlier and decided to hike up and over it again on my return in case he was still sleeping. But when I re-entered the trail, I didn't see any signs of him, and so I'm looking, I know he's got to be somewhere. Aha, there he is up ahead, right by the trail again, munching on the grassy plain. So I decide I'm going to cut through a prairie dog town, and even though I'm sure the big guy knew I was there, I just didn't want to rattle his cage or get too close. But these silly prairie dog guards, not used to people walking around their burrows, were all screeching their alarm. I'm like, shut up, I don't want to alert this guy. And the big guy starts walking towards me. I think it was a coincidence, but he's walking my way. And I was really glad when I finally turned a bend where there's some taller bushes and trees that put him out of my sight. These guys are so massive, their heads have got to be at least 2 feet high, and they have to weigh a couple of tons. If you tick off the buffalo, you're going to lose the battle. The rule for wildlife is that you hold your fist out with your thumb up in the air like in a thumbs up sign, and you should be able to position that thumb over whatever beast you're looking at, whether it's a bear, elk, moose, or in this case the bison. Your thumb should completely cover the animal. That means that you're a far enough distance away. And usually with the big animals, that means several hundred feet of distance. And even if you're that far away and you see change in behavior of the animal, that still means you're too close and you need to be careful. I'm going to put a link to my Adventure Travel Show podcast episode on bear safety in the show notes. That episode and webpage has more details on this important subject, and a lot of the bear safety information is applicable to any wildlife, say in this example, the bison. Happily, I made it safely back to my car, and I started heading east. I'm at the westernmost part of my road trip, and even though it's going to take me a couple of months, it's time for me to start heading back home. I actually crossed the exact geographical midpoint of the country today. I'd seen a notation on my map, and then I passed a sign saying I was crossing the Continental Divide. I think that's misworded, as the Continental Divide is really back in the Rockies, but I knew they were talking geographically. I was at the center of the country. I have 2 ways to figure out where to go next. Let's say my dinner companions last night recommended someplace cool to go, which in fact they did, the Peace Gardens up on the border of Canada. If it weren't for COVID, I'd have gone up there. But since you can't visit the Canadian side right now, and it's an extra hundreds and hundreds of miles away, I decided to pass on it, but make a mental note to try to see it if ever I'm back in that area again. I saw online it's a gorgeous formal garden filled with a gazillion flowers celebrating and encouraging peace in the world. It's acres and acres of loveliness and surely is worth a visit. I'll put a link in the show notes. My second way of choosing a place is either I've read something or heard something about a place, and I make a note on my paper atlas. I cut up little pieces of the small mini Post-it sticks, make a note on it, and I stick it on the map. So as I'm driving through, I said, oh, that's got, I would see in the future, Peace Gardens, go there if I'm up in that area. Or I've got a friend that lives here, or there's a listener that lives here. And I try to weave and incorporate as many of these little sticky notes on my paper atlas as I can into my travels. Looking at my map, I see a big lake, and my handwriting on the note says, in all caps, birds. I have no idea why I made that note. All I know is I love birds. That's where I'm going, and that's where I'm heading next. The land's gotten pretty flat now, mostly covered with prairie and pasture land, but then I start seeing all these small, gorgeous blue lakes. I later discovered that I drove through what is referred to as the Prairie Pothole region. When the glaciers receded around 10,000 years ago, they left behind thousands of small depressions called potholes, kettles, or sloughs. And because of the glacial silt, like I discussed in the Glacier National Park episode, I'll put a note in the show notes, they retain a stunning crystal blue color. All this water attracts waterfowl, and the woodlands that are in Graham's Island State Park, where I'm heading, attract an abundance of those pretty and songful yellow warblers, flycatchers, Baltimore orioles, and woodpeckers. When I arrive, I am enchanted. I have never heard so many songbirds in my life. In fact, if you listen to, I think it was the Arizona Sophie Diaries, you can hear the birds in the background. Even though my microphone shouldn't have been able to pick them up, they were so loud you could still hear it. In fact, Taylor, the young man that I met at Bryce and Zion, thought I put in a soundtrack and thought it was pretty cool. I thought that was hysterical. Not only do I have this great songbird background music, I'm blessed with absolutely perfect weather. The gentle breeze kept any bugs at bay, the temperatures are in their mid-70s, and I had a nice view of Devil's Lake. And this I hadn't realized either. I have green grass under my toes and my feet. I hadn't had the luxury of grass between my toes all year, and there isn't a lot of green grass in the desert areas where I've been visiting most of this spring. I was truly in heaven and had that wonderful, full feeling of happiness and contentment in my chest. I decided this must mean I truly am an East Coast gal. No matter how much I love the desert, how much I love the rocks, how much the Rockies are gorgeous and the people are fun and fine and just lots of things to do, I simply belong on the East Coast. I love big canopied trees. I love grassy knolls. I like mountains with shade. I like trails with shade. I loved it so much there, I booked a second night. Devil's Lake is North Dakota's largest lake. The Sioux called it Minnewakan, believed to mean spirit or holy water, perhaps influenced by drowned warriors and massive waves, I've read. But the early settlers called it Bad Spirit, and that morphed into Devil's Lake. Mostly people come here to boat and fish, but they do have a hiking trail and in the winter a cross-country ski trail. It's not very crowded, even though at over 1,100 acres there are a lot of RVs, campers, and day visitors here. They're mostly out in the water, and that lake is so big you hardly even see them. So I had the trail all to myself, and the next day rode my bike on the roads and hardly anybody passed me. The little town of Devil's Lake is nearby where you can get most of your needs, but there's a word of caution. Make sure when you are out in this area, you keep your gas tank topped up. It's often a long, long way in between gas stations. Out of the 10 bars that register how much gas I have in the tank, I got down to 2 bars, I topped up again. Another piece of advice, if you come here, get a site on the perimeter that has a water view, if not waterfront, because in the back you get flies. The main La Rose RV park in the visitor center area is nicer than most RV parks, but if you've got a big rig, choose one of the sites on the outskirts of the irregular roads. They're much nicer, they're private, and they're under the hardwood trees instead of exposed. Most of the prettiest sites are double campsites here, so if you want those, you pay twice the price. I use single site number 53 in the Prairie Dog campground, and I like that one in number 52 if you come this way. From here, my original thought was to head up to International Falls and Voyageurs National Park up by the Canadian border. However, all the boat tours were full, so I decided to pass on that, because being out on the water up there, that's the whole point. I had one from there to go to Boundary Waters. I sent out some inquiries hoping to join a canoe guided group tour, but I didn't hear back on a timely basis, and it was a long way out of the way, and so I decided, I don't want to drive up there, find out I can't join something, and have driven hundreds of miles for nothing. So instead, I decided to head more south and east towards Duluth on Lake Superior. En route, I spent the night at a city campground in the little town of Foston. It was right downtown, so I was able to walk to about a mile to have a really nice dinner. And en route to dinner, I noticed a really nice long bike trail that I decided to take advantage of the next morning. One thing I've noticed about the upper Midwest is they have tons and tons of bike trails. I don't see many people biking on them, so I suspect they're more used as snowmobile paths in the winter, as in some towns I'd see signs either allowing or disallowing their use on a particular path. Regardless, it's nice to have so many off-road biking options. The town of Foston isn't really a tourist town, so people were checking me out, the stranger, as I sat at the bar. The folks were friendly enough, but I was obviously in the locals' hangout and received no more than a passing glance. In the morning, I took a really nice 2-hour bike ride. After I'd used up the bike path, I went up this quiet country road, I don't know how many miles, and yet only one car passed me the whole time. In the distance, I can hear elk bugling. I think that's what they call it. The roadsides were filled with wildflowers, and I passed many small and medium-sized potholes or lakes. When I got back from my ride, I wanted to take advantage of the shower they supposedly had. My city campground of maybe half a dozen sites was attached to the public works property adjacent to the residential area. The signage in the campground was terrible. I could see where the spaces were to camp, but I couldn't find the bathhouse. So I returned to my iOverlander app that first told me about this campground and read a review that said that the bathroom was in the first building. So I drive Sophie over there, and indeed, there's an unmarked door, and that led to a single toilet as well as a shower room. I had no reason to be afraid, but I got really uncomfortable that I could be in the shower and come out and somebody could be standing in that foyer area. We were isolated from everything. There was no people around, and I felt really vulnerable that if a worker who happened to be a bad guy happened to see me go in there knowing I was going in to take a shower because I got a towel and I'd be undressed, I just had bad vibes about it. So I just took the fastest shower of my life and got out of there gratefully. I met nobody happily, but it's one of the few times in this whole road trip that I got the heebie-jeebies, because I knew I was in a vulnerable situation that had I yelled, nobody would have heard me. I try to be alert to my surroundings and to pay attention to these kinds of vulnerabilities. I feel really safe in the woods, but I get a lot more insecure when I'm either camping near a road or in a town. I worry about opportunistic crimes. Like I said, somebody showed up to work that day, wasn't planning on raping or murdering somebody, but they see a lone female in a vulnerable situation. That's the kind of crime I worry about. I don't think it's very likely, but that's the kind of thing that makes me nervous. I worry about townies more, especially if they've been drinking or doing drugs, and they might see an opportunity for doing harm and pounce, especially if under the influence. That's why my general rule is not to tent close enough to a road that somebody be able to carry a case of beer. Inside Sophie, I feel pretty safe, and I figure I could drive away if I felt in danger. In fact, I always keep her in the able to drive forward motion. I'm always ready to pull straight out. I leave my key ready to go in the ignition. It's always readily accessible. And the few times I felt a little nervous, I've got wasp spray that I figured would be a good repellent if somebody tried to break in. But enough about potential perils. Most days I feel extremely safe. I just want to relay these thought processes in case that helps you. This is how I assess danger and risks as I travel as a solo female. So, from this little town, I took back roads. I'm zigzagging across the Mississippi River as I head east. In fact, the headwaters of this great river form up here. I'm out in the countryside and heading to a campground I found on the app. It's a paid campground, and the prices have gone way up since the last poster on the app. I try to keep this show evergreen, so I rarely talk prices, but I will say that I'm paying for camping and a pit toilet site almost and sometimes as much as I paid last summer for full water and electric hookups. I've been paying up to about $25 for most non-amenity campsites that usually have a picnic table and a fire ring and a common pit toilet for the entire campground. These usually have self-paying stations at the entrance and are often first come, first served, so bring lots of small bill cash. Some, but definitely not all, accept credit cards or checks, but you're putting all that credit card information that you're writing it on an envelope, and who knows what clerk is clearing that box, so I just prefer to pay the cash. Full hookup RV sites have been running around $45. In busy touristy areas, rates can be much higher. I paid over $75 for a tent-only site by Zion National Park. I have no idea and don't even want to know what they charge the RV folks in the park, but probably at least double, if not more than that. I'm glad I only paid to stay one night at this one place. It was really buggy and the mosquitoes could carry you away. It was beautiful, but you couldn't sit outside without suffering. Believe me, I tried. I have this really nice fold-up chair that has a sun canopy overhead and then netting I can put down on the sides if it gets buggy. So I was able to keep the mosquitoes out, but just sitting there on the dirt area by my campsite, 2 huge ticks crawled up my leg. No Lyme disease for me, thank you. So after a couple hours, I gave up and just went inside the van. Fortunately, I have a magnetic screen that goes across Sophie's sliding door opening, so I can at least enjoy the view and the fresh air. So even though it was really pretty, in the morning, I skipped a walk and just headed out. I didn't want to get chewed up by bugs. When I got to Duluth, I could see that it looked like a typical industrial city on the water. I wanted to head up the western coast of Lake Superior, which is huge. Lake Superior boasts the largest land surface area of any lake in the world and the 3rd largest in volume. While you can see land across some sections of the lake that I visited, it gives you the impression that you're looking out over the ocean. My plan is to head to Gooseberry Falls Campground, north of Duluth. It's a pretty drive, and I stopped in a little town called Two Harbors to resupply, and I did a little drive around. Cute little town. And as I headed out, I saw a town campground right on the lake. And since I was at that magic hour between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning where people are checking out and there might be some first come first served spots available, I figured, what the heck, I'll see if they've got any available. And I see an empty RV spot with a water view. I can't believe my good fortune, and this is a Friday. So I parked Sophie in the spot and I race around trying to figure out where do I go to pay for it. I found a tourist office next door, so I checked with them. They said, no, you got to go around this building, around the woods. And so I get there, and the gal at the desk says, no, all the RV spots are booked. And so I asked her if she had any other shady spots available for Friday and Saturday, and she said no. However, she did have one sunny spot left, and I was worried that I was going to be shut out of Gooseberry, so I said I'd go ahead and take it. To my most happy surprise, this quote-unquote sunny spot was smack dab on the best site overlooking the lake. I could not believe my good fortune. Somebody must have done a last-minute cancellation, is all I can figure, because a tenter nearby commented on my great spot, and his eyes opened wide when I told him I was just to walk in. With Sophie and all these pleasant temperatures, meaning that I'm still sleeping in her instead of setting up my screen porch room because it hasn't gotten hot outside at night yet, it means that set up for me just means parking her. And once parked, I head into town on my bike so I could really explore. Two Harbors has a cute lighthouse and a nice path along the lake. Downtown has many restaurants, and I checked Yelp for suggestions for dinner later that night, choosing a place called McQuaid's. When I walked in during dinner hour, I was surprised it wasn't more crowded. I'm not sure if this is from COVID fear or that I was a little further from the downtown area, but I had most of the bar area to myself. My bartender, Jared, was a font of information for me, helping me to figure out what I wanted to see while I was up in the area and how far I should drive up the coastline to get a good feel of the landscape without driving more than I had to. While it would have been nice to see the artist colony at Grand Marais, according to Jared, once I passed Titulus State Park, I'd have gotten a great idea of the coastal scenic beauty, but it wouldn't change that much from there on. I had hoped to drive up the whole coastline and then catch the Grand Portage ferry over to Isle Royale National Park, but you guessed it, the ferries are completely booked for the near future. That meant I'd have had a long up and back. I was, however, able to get seats on the Copper Harbor ferry out of Michigan, but not for another 10 days. This meant I'd have to spend a filler week after this weekend. I know I'm not going to have any problems finding things to do, but I ordinarily wouldn't take 6 days to drive less than 300 miles. But I digress. Let's get back to my meal with Jared in Two Harbors. I got to try cheese curds. This is a Canadian border delicacy I'd first heard raves about on my Quebec episode. I'll put links in the show notes. In my mind, I'm picturing some gooey, melty cheese blobs, but how I would actually describe cheese curds, it's like fried cheese hush puppies. They're all nice and melty, cheesy goodness on the inside of crispy, battered, deep fried outside. Really tasty, and I ate way more than I should. At Jared's suggestion, I also had the black and blue burger, which is quite tasty as well. Completely stuffed, I walked back to camp to enjoy the late sunset. One thing I like about being this far north is that I don't have to rush to head out in the morning to beat the heat. I'm back to leisurely drinking my huge pot of green tea and reading for an hour or so. Couldn't do that in the desert at all. And even though it's not the best setup, my body was really feeling my lack of morning stretches, so now I'm doing it on the floor of Sophie. It's certainly not perfect, but it's better than the nothing I've been doing for the last few months. I can already feel the difference in my flexibility. I'm also starting to do my core work and push-ups again. And the first time I did push-ups, where I used to do 30 real ones instead of the half ones on your knees, my arms hurt for 2 days, and I must say the dips down were kind of pitiful. But slowly I'm regaining my upper body strength after 3 months of upper body neglect. After my tea, I head to Gooseberry Falls State Park to do some hiking. You can also do some great biking from here too, as there's an off-road trail that goes, I think it's like 23 miles up and back from the park. It's called the Gichigami State Trail. And I believe I read that there are plans to run this the entire length of the coast. That's going to be pretty cool. I want to do a long hike today and plan to do Upper Falls along the Gooseberry River, plus a section of the 310-mile-long Superior Hiking Trail, which runs from the Canadian border to the southern terminus of the Wisconsin border, very close to Lake Superior's western border. But when I got to Superior Connector, rather than a dirt trail, this was a mowed, or I should rather say a yet-to-be mowed path as far as I could see, and I just didn't want to be tick bait. In addition to hiking in this park, you can, of course, kayak the lake, and there are lots of mountain biking trails, as well as the paved trail I mentioned earlier. They also have the campground that I originally hoped to stay in. So after hiking a couple of shorter trails, I still had time to go to Titulus State Park. You pass this really cute lighthouse in the way that you are able to get inside and visit, but I preferred to hike and continue north. I loved the coastline trails at this park. Whereas you see waterfalls and the river that leads to the rocky beach of Superior at Gooseberry, here at Titulus you have this beautiful cliff shoreline that has cute little coves and overall fantastic shoreline views. I also saw a lot more kayak activity here, no doubt because of the prettier shoreline. Because the days are so long when you're this far north in the summer, I don't think it really gets dark till like 9:30. When I got back to camp, I still had plenty of time to relax in front of the lake and read. This has been a great stop, and I highly recommend this area. I wanted to see the Apostle Islands, but the cruise boat that explores these islands is, of course, all booked up. What else is new? But today is rainy, and as I'm checking out on my Burlington Bay campground, I decide I'm going to head there anyway. Maybe with the bad weather, somebody's not going to show up. The 3-hour cruise departs at 1 p.m., and I get there at 12:45. I park, race into the ticket office, and they say there is room for me, so I have to scramble to find a parking place for Sophie away from the cute downtown of Bayfield that allows more than 2-hour parking, and race back to catch the cruise. I am so glad I took this chance. So yes, the weather wasn't optimal, and when you're out on the deck, the rain was cold, as well as obviously very wet, but the tour is amazing. The edges of some of these islands have as high as 50-foot tall sandstone cliffs, and there's caves cut out by all the waves. So you see these beautiful brown and red Swiss cheese caves, arches and coves all up and down the sides. And actually, the rain emphasized and enhanced the red coloring of the stone cliffs. The red is from the iron that this area happens to mine, I might add. Sometimes we would see these odd rock formations called sea stacks, where the waves eroded rocks oddly and eventually isolated them from the main island, kind of like a mushroom in the middle of the water. Surprisingly, some of the islands have sandy beaches instead of the round rocks I saw earlier. This is caused from sand eroding off the cliffs and the bluffs that eventually deposits down below. The area rock is made of brownstone and sandstone. When the glacier was here, the weight compacted the sedimentation, which then became the area's bedrock. And when that glacier melted, the lake was actually several hundred feet higher than it is now, according to the captain, but eventually it seeped out and leveled down to its current height. It was enchanting. We also went past several of the 7 lighthouses, and the captain explained how when the first lighthouse was built, the contractor didn't get paid right away because he built the lighthouse on the wrong island. I'm sure he lost a ton of money, and they wouldn't pay him until he built the lighthouse on the proper island. The Jesuits named the Apostle Islands. Whenever they arrived someplace that didn't have a name, they gave it a holy name. No one knows for sure why the Jesuits named these islands Apostle Islands, but the captain, who grew up here, theorizes that from Oak Island you can see 11 other islands, and so he believes it's after the 12 apostles. The Apostle Islands itself comprise 22 islands, but like I said, you can't see all of them at the main place. Lake Superior has been an important commerce channel for centuries. Native Ojibwe, I'm probably mispronouncing that, so I apologize, and other tribes used birch canoes to traverse this enormous lake. And the fur traders soon adopted the same method. Now you can occasionally see cargo ships dotting the horizon. And I forgot to mention that I stopped at 2 of the Apostle Island Visitor Center areas en route, and I was starting to hike along the cliffs by the area of Myers Beach, but that's more of a kayak launch area so that you can see the caves rather than a visitor center. And to get to where the coves were, it was going to take a couple hours hiking in total mud, so it's only boardwalked for a certain while. So rather than get all muddy, I decided I would instead try my luck up at Bayfield. Maybe I could get on one of the cruises. And I'm glad I did, because I later learned from one of the cruise attendants that people often get close to the edge of the cliff because they're trying to look in the caves and they fall in the water, which not only is brutally cold, it's really hard to climb off these cliffs and get back up onto the main part of the island. So on my boat ride, the captain explained that once an 8-point buck fell in the water and could only make it to a cave ledge, but not up the cliff to safety. And the rangers told the distraught locals that there's not going to be any rescue. Nature had to take its course. But after several days, a kayaker just couldn't stand it, and she knew how to call deer. And she spent a couple hours calling to the deer, who eventually trusted her enough to jump in, swam to her, and she was able to get the deer to safety. The captain said he's also had to rescue many a person, as well as once a dog who had slipped off. He posted the dog video on his Facebook, where normally he's happy to get just a few likes, but in the morning he saw that 20,000 people had viewed his video. Also before my cruise, I stopped by the Little Sand Bay Visitor Center. You can walk out on the docks and look inside an old boat and the net rigging and how they lived life back in the day. And the storm waves here must be ferocious. To protect the docks, they've built these massive boulder-filled cages, I'm going to guess like 10 feet wide and as high as your head if you're standing on the dock, but also down to the sea bottom. I'm guessing this is to help buffer the waves from destroying the docks. In this area, kayaking is king. It's the #1 activity in the Apostle Islands. If you want to kayak up here, it's recommended that you use at least a 15-foot sea kayak and wear a wetsuit. The average temperature is 43 degrees, and it's 54 degrees here on the 3rd week of July, so it's cold year-round. Lots of people hope to see these caves in winter when they form ice caves. With the waves bashing against the caves, it'll form these little icicles. Really cool. However, during that time of year, it's not always safe to come out here, and if the weather's dicey, which it often is, they might cancel your cruise on you. Ice also forms around the islands, but this generally melts by bay. The captain said that one summer it hung around till July, and they sadly missed cruising on their big Memorial Day weekend because of all the ice. If you want to stay out of the islands, there's camping on Oak, Stockton, Madeline, Rocky, and Sand Islands. And there's usually at least a small hiking trail on these islands. The best hiking is on Oak, Stockton, and Outer Islands. Madeline Island has its own state park, and there's a direct ferry. It's the only developed island, as far as I understand, and it even has a museum. Use the town of Bayfield as your base camp. There's plenty of restaurants and shops to entertain you when you're off the water. But after the cruise, I decided just to grab a hot meal in town and then continue east. As I continued along the coast, I stopped in the town of Ashland, which became my home base for a couple of days. It was early morning when I arrived, and I saw this really pretty park in the lake, so I pulled in and parked, and I got a superb view of the water. I wanted to work on the show today, and this is perfect. I got a great view, I got a bathroom, and 3 bars of cell coverage. I couldn't ask for anything better, unless of course it had a shower. After I finished work, I went into the town proper and thought it was really nice. Although it did look like it had fallen on hard times a bit, and many of the cute homes, a lot of Victorian styled, they needed a fresh coat of paint or a new roof. But I love the architecture, especially the downtown brick buildings. Checking Zillow, the prices are really affordable. And there's not many places you can say that about these days. And they have a really nice long bike path that I rode on day 2. And like I mentioned earlier, this whole region is loaded with long bike trails, although many are gravel, which I'm trying to stick mainly to pave for my bike. I stealth camped that first night because I so liked my setup and I wanted to allow more time to explore this cute town. Whenever I want to stealth camp, and by that I mean I want to sleep in Sophie in a non-recognized campsite area. In this case, I'm going to be sleeping on the street. So I have a strategy. I look for a nice but working class neighborhood. Fancier homes, I'm guessing, are going to bring more persnickety residents about having a strange van on their street. So that's why I try to pick more working class that are used to seeing vans around. Then I try to find where the homes meet the local trade businesses. And I don't park in vision of somebody's home. I don't want somebody being able to look out of their house and see my van. So I try to park adjacent to the residential areas, but by a business. And tonight, I'm going to be parking in front of a HVAC business. I got there a little bit too early because it wasn't even 5 o'clock, and the workers returned around 4:30, but nobody paid me any attention. If I was going to have a problem, it's probably going to happen before 6 o'clock. Again, there was no parking signs, no overnight signs, so I always follow all the rules. But like I said, after 6 o'clock, nobody said a word, and I was gone by 5 o'clock in the morning before anybody ever came to work. So I went back to my nice little town park and watched the sunrise over Lake Superior. After another day of work in Ashland, I head east to a county park raved about on my iOverlander app. And I totally concur. This delightful mini free county campground has 4 campsites with picnic table and fire ring. It's nestled in the woods and there are hardly any bugs. And there's a beautiful waterfall that I can hear from my site. In the morning, I head down to check out the waterfall. It's got a nice trail that ends with a ton of steps. And I need some steps right now, as I'm also supposed to be training on stairs at least once a week in preparation for my Dolomites hike this fall. Now that I've moved away from the Rockies, this land is more rolling hills and I don't get much elevation change anymore when I hike. So I went up and down the stairs 10 times, and when I went up, I took 2 stairs at a time, and I've been told only go down 1 stair at a time to protect your knees, but whenever possible, try to go up 2 steps at a time. According to my phone, my 10 flights was equivalent to 54 flights of stairs, and my sweat-stained shirt concurred. I am really enjoying Michigan, especially the delightful summer temperatures. I cannot believe that I can work out, say a really hard bike ride, in the middle of the afternoon and hardly sweat. But it's time to leave Michigan mainland and cross Lake Superior via ferry to backpack Isle Royale. While I've been hiking and biking up a storm and feel like I'm in really good physical shape, I have not been training my body to carry 35 pounds, so hopefully I've not made an error, as my next adventure is to backpack Isle Royale for 6 days. And once you get to this remote area, you are 100% committed to being there for your allotted time because the ferries are booked, and I'm sure there's not going to be any room at the inn, so should I find myself ill-prepared for this adventure, I'm going to be in trouble. So next up, we'll see how I did at Isle Royale National Park, noted for being the least visited of the lower 48 national parks, and that's simply because it's difficult to get to. However, it's America's most revisited national park. We'll find out why in the next show. I want to remind you that if you go to the activetraveladventures.com website, on the navigation bar, you'll see a Travel With Me link. I'm posting my planned adventure travel tours, so if you're interested, come on, join me. For 2022, I'm going to be spending my time in Central and South America. I'm basically moving down there and just heading south. I planned a long-distance coast-to-coast hike in Costa Rica. It's going to be long, it's going to be hard, but I think it's going to be really fun and really cool. We're going to be going through 5 ecosystems, rafting, hiking, and visiting villages that are not touristed by anyone. So that's going to be super cool. And actually, we'll be one of the first 1,000 people ever to have done this hike. So if you're interested in that, hit me up for more information. After that, I'm going to the Galapagos. I'm going to be doing some more adventures in Ecuador before going further south to hike in Patagonia and climb Machu Picchu. I'd love for you to join me. It's going to be a blast, and I hope you'll think about joining me for one or more trips. And I've got some promo discount codes I can email you on some of the trips, so hit me up if you're interested, kit@activetraveladventures.com. You'll be saving some money, while at no additional cost, you'll be helping to support this podcast and keeping it ad-free, which I know we all appreciate. I don't want to be pushing Me Undies or Blue Apron or all the other big podcast ad things that interrupt the flow of the show. So I'm trying really hard not to do that, but I am retired and I do feel the pinch now. So if you can support the show by using my links on the website, using my Amazon link that you'll find on the website or at the bottom of your phone on the show notes here, I would be most grateful. It costs you nothing, and it's an easy way to support the show at no additional cost to you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!